All right, so with today's talk, I'm pleased to introduce a good colleague who's just actually on the other side of the wall today as we're in the office here at the Great Lakes Science Center, Cory Brant. Cory is going to be speaking to us today about some work he's been doing on historical data, developing a database. Cory joined the Great Lakes Science Center on sort of a co-appointment with the Great Lakes Fishery Commission. I didn't get the date, Cory, around 2019 or so.
Yeah, you got it.
Okay, and then became a permanent biologist with us 2020.
Yep, in summer 2020. Yeah.
Okay, and you got your PhD at Michigan State University.
Yeah.
So he's a sea lamprey expert. Has written a well-acclaimed book that has been out for a couple of years, but I know he enjoys native fish restoration work as well, which is of course a key part of why we control lamprey. So I look forward to your talk. It's going to be about 40 or 45 minutes, depending on how things go, and we hope that all of you will stick around for questions and discussion if you are able. So with that, Cory, floor is yours. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks, Bo. Thanks, Renee. Thanks for inviting me to this and for having me on this. And I really look forward to these science seminars every time. I've loved learning from these and having the discussion in these seminars. So it's really a privilege to be able to speak at one. So right off the bat, I first want to acknowledge all the co-authors, co-PIs on the initial project for this study. It's a really amazing group of people to work with that I'm showing here, really multidisciplinary team. We have spatial scientists and data experts and librarians, mapping experts and ecologists, folks familiar with management and history. It's a really cool team to have been working with. And so I want to acknowledge the team, and I also want to do special acknowledgement for Kieran Tyrell, Carissa Hannas, two research technicians that came on once we were funded for this project, and both have totally taken a dive into the archives with us. They're just critical members of this team for finding and researching records, entering data, QA, QC. I can't thank them enough. Both recent graduates from MSU and up and coming fish and wildlife professionals. I also want to thank agencies around the basin that have helped us with source leads, with securing records. This list just keeps growing and growing. A lot of these online archives and catalogs really made a lot of things accessible during the pandemic. And there's a lot of scanning and PDFs and things available. It was really exciting, kind of a silver lining of being shut in during the pandemic. We did a lot of our searching for records at that time. A lot of these online catalogs were just an amazing resource, and connections and people and agencies as well. So why preserve fisheries? I just want to jump into a very general slide first. Why preserve history, whether it relates to fisheries or environmental problems in any way? And the first point I just want to give a shout out to is the shifting baselines theory, coined by Daniel Pauly in 1995. It's become a very popular piece of the literature, or basically shifting baseline syndrome can happen. It's basically this gradual change in what we accept as a normal condition or a baseline condition of the natural environment. It shifts due to the lack of past information or past context. If records and things aren't saved, new and upcoming managers and scientists and professionals really just won't have access to that information or that context. And so what we think is normal tends to shift. So it's really critical to preserve the past so that we can always have that information to get an idea of that baseline. This can deal with populations of fish or other animals. It can deal with behavior of organisms, especially in fisheries related to migrations or spawning grounds or habitat use. These things can shift if we don't look to the past. And so, in a nutshell, we need a good description of that foundational condition if we want to make any comparisons or try to look for any changes in an environment. One of my favorites, it supports inductive research, which is kind of a fancy way of saying it allows you to explore new research questions by laying out a lot of data at once and looking for new trends, searching for patterns, learning new things. If you don't have a good spread of historical data, well, I guess what I'm trying to say is it helps you form new hypotheses and explore new questions really well. And then you can compare past and present habitats, more specifically for certain projects. You can help prioritize restoration efforts by comparing the past and the present, thinking about the future, just kind of an avenue, a big picture avenue that we're going down with this project that I'm going to talk about today. So I first want to show the coregonine restoration framework. Many have maybe seen this, and a lot of people are talking about this. This is an exciting collaborative effort across the Great Lakes Basin. There's a lot of partners. Our primary drive to dive into the history of coregonine spawning records was specifically looking at this part of the planning phase of the framework, the gap analysis, which is defined as describing and mapping historical and contemporary populations and habitats, and comparing historical and contemporary, and using that information to inform distribution models and things like that. So it's a really, a deep dive into history really will inform this planning phase and many of the other planning phases of this restoration framework. So that's sort of our primary impetus for this research. So today I'm just gonna, during this talk, I'm gonna go through three main things. One is to review history of coregonines in the Great Lakes. I can tend to get a little bit bogged down with history because I love history, but I tended to try to keep this in the context of humans, the relationship with these fishes, and specifically the relationship with spawning areas for these fishes, because it's critical context for how we find records in the archives. The reason why things were recorded was because there's this human connection with this species or these species and their spawning areas. I also want to summarize how we're researching, finding records, organizing them into a database that we've now named CORHIST, the coregonine history database. So some exciting data things, and then talk about how we want to begin to use these data. So diving into the history, I first want to talk about human connections with coregonines, and to start that conversation, human connection with coregonines in the Great Lakes begins with the first fishing families in the basin. Indigenous communities have relied on coregonines long before archable materials existed, in the sense that we know them. And with this came a deep connection with coregonine behavior, coregonine spawning areas, and that knowledge was passed from generation to generation for thousands of years. So some of our earliest spawning records that we've been able to uncover, many of our earliest records come from indigenous fishing activity and knowledge, and indigenous ecological knowledge is still teaching us about spawning areas for coregonines today. And so I want to also give a shout out to Alex Duncan et al.'s paper that's very hot off the press, where they investigated indigenous ecological knowledge into the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation area of the Bruce Peninsula of Lake Huron, and have some really exciting maps presented in this paper, and the knowledge that they saved is incredible. I highly recommend you download this paper. I also just learned that Alex will be talking next month at the seminar series, which I'm really excited for. So good timing to give a shout out. The history of spawning areas for coregonines is sort of a sad and long tale throughout the last 100 years or so, or 200 years really, in the Great Lakes Basin. But there's also, it's a story shrouded with a lot of mystery. There's exciting things to discover about these species. And one of the records that I want to start with that we come across, one of the types, are these riverine, these tributary spawning populations of coregonines that we get in the records pretty early on. we have plenty, not plenty, but we have some records of coregonines entering rivers and spawning, especially cisco and whitefish, and some information about where those reaches, these spawning reaches were. And in the archival research, in the historical records, really the primary reason given for why those disappeared was the logging era. So as cities started to develop, we had a lot of European immigration and cities began to build. We had the logging eras, industrial revolution. A lot of things were happening where the rivers were essentially used as conveyor belts for logs. That ended up ruining a lot of the habitat physically in the river, but they also produced a lot of pulp and other pollution, which would smother grounds, not only within the river, but outside the river mouths and deep, sometimes quite a distance offshore. So by about the 1880s and 90s, our records tend to really fade on riverine spawning populations. And that's been tied to logging activity. But logging wasn't the only thing. There was a lot of exploitation leading into the turn of the century for these riverine spawning populations. And this is sort of a grainy old postcard, but what it depicts is a 3 hours spearing expedition for whitefish near Indian River, Michigan. So an inland, what was considered an inland population, possibly in the river. The thing is that coregonines that were spawning in shallow areas were very vulnerable to fishing pressure, similar to Atlantic salmon and tributaries in Lake Ontario. They were very vulnerable. You could catch a lot very quickly, depending on the gear you were using. Another thing I want to cover just for fishing methods and how they tie into records is seining activity. In the early days, seining was really popular for coregonines. I really like these photos because some of you may be spotting where we're at, because you can spot the Fort Gratiot light right across the river there. So this is the mouth of Lake Huron, and this is the entrance of the St. Clair River right here. We're on the other side of the river. There were seining operations along the entire St. Clair and Detroit River for big runs of ciscos that used to run up this river. And they would get pretty shallow. So seines could reach these spawning shoals, these migrating shoals pretty well. And the seines, it's a fairly simple operation. They'd be run out into the river with a rowboat and then pulled back in, typically with a mule. And you could catch a lot of coregonines this way. We have some records where thousands, tens of thousands were caught in one haul. And these seines could get miles long. And they oftentimes didn't know what to do with that many fish. So they'd be dumped as refuse on the shore if they couldn't be frozen or packed in barrels in time. Seining generally in the records tends to be a pretty destructive activity back in the day. A lot of fish were killed in this method, but it gives us a picture of a lot of our records, I guess is what I'm trying to say. In the earlier days are shallower and were actually the results of seining activity. Later on, technology starts to develop. We get into the Mackinac boat era. This allowed fishing families to move farther out from ports, set gill nets. This is really kind of a game changer for the fishery. If fisheries were exploited in embayments or near ports, you can now get out onto reefs offshore a little bit more and set your gill nets. And so gradually our records, as you get later into the turn of the century, they tend to get out into the lake a little bit more. Eventually we evolve into the steamer days, steam tugs. This allowed you to go way offshore, fish certain spawning areas. You could even fish a different lake than your port with a boat like this. You could pretty much go anywhere once you get into the steam tug days. And you could fish in some pretty bad weather with these as well, including during many of the coregonine spawning time. So we have a lot of records from this type of fishing activity, especially gill netting. But you'll notice that they still needed to manually pull that gill net over a roller arm back in the day. Eventually we evolved to more of the Great Lakes style fishing tug. These would really allow you to get out offshore, fish during spawning seasons in the fall and winter. This one's fishing for cisco in the winter, and you can see frost all over the boat. You were enclosed, a little bit safer. We do have a lot of records from this style of commercial fishing as well, more offshore. Another gear I just want to take some time to mention is the pound net, because we have a lot of records from this type of fishing. And this type of fishing actually leaves a mark in the lake. So folks not familiar with pound net fishing, it's a really cool way to fish where they would actually pound stakes into the sediment and that would anchor your net. It's kind of like a modified trap net, but it was held in place with pound nets. So really you could get out, if you had long stakes, you could fish almost at 60 feet of water. But these were really popular in Lake Erie because you don't get super deep in the western end, and you could really set these out far from shore. Sometimes they're called pond nets as well, because there's a crib end to these nets that you could actually lift up like a little pond, and all the fish were alive inside. Here they're catching Cisco, and you can see that those fish are alive. It kind of creates like a little mini pond. So pound nets are pond nets. A little bit more detail about these. Here's a map from the 1880s showing pound net locations. I'll zoom in on this, but I wanted to just sort of generally show how these worked back then. They could be quite extensive. So you've got this leader coming from shore. It would lead to a heart, and that would focus fish then into a pod or a crib. And you could connect, so a leader, a heart, and a crib is a pound net, but you could connect these together and chain them out, and they could be miles and miles out from shore. And they essentially create kind of like a wall for the fish. So they do get corralled in here quite efficiently, especially if you're in shallower spawning shoals for like Cisco or whitefish, for example. And so they're really popular in Lake Erie, and there are early maps that show where those were. If I push in on a section a little bit more and zoom it up, each one of these little C shapes and lines is a leader, a heart, and a crib. And so some of these were 17, 20-pound nets long. And you can see the fishing pressure, even in 1887 in Lake Erie, during the spawning migrations and runs getting into November for Cisco and whitefish, fish trying to get to the Maumee River mouth or anywhere around this western end. They went through quite a gauntlet back then. It's actually quite crazy. I think this one's probably 40-pound nets long. And so, this is all extremely important spawning area for Cisco historically and whitefish. So if I overlay modern navigational charts onto a section of this map, and then I'll zoom that in, you can see that a lot of those pound net stakes were actually flagged as navigational hazards. And so they really did cover this entire area with pound nets as late as 1880. And you can see this kind of looks like leftover heart. You can see leader lines coming out. The stakes are basically everywhere. And so sometimes we tap into these early navigational charts to confirm that we're on the fishing grounds or on the reef or out from the certain shoal that they mention. And it's sort of a legacy that's left there. And a lot of times, there was some excess fishing, especially for Cisco's. And so without knowing what to do with these fish, a lot of them were frozen and sent to mink farms. A lot of them were dumped. There was, it's sort of a classic as we get into the really big business fisheries back in the day. There was a lot of waste. We also have eras of increase or pulses in fishery surveys and science in the Great Lakes, the 20s and 30s. Especially, there's this big surge in binational cooperation in natural history like surveys. This is the Celts era, the Van Oosten era. You get a big pulse of fisheries independent records in this time. And just this isn't as spawning related, but I had to throw in something about lamprey, is that there were a few final nails in the coffin for a lot of these species, especially in the lower lakes. Lamprey, they certainly were susceptible to lamprey attacks, and lamprey took a toll in the 40s and 50s. We get a little drop in records due to mainly World War II, and there isn't a lot of like fish survey funding in the 40s and 50s, but also lamprey took a toll. And then other ecosystem changes in the Great Lakes that were kind of deal breakers for some coregonines. Invasions like alewife, invasions like dreissindid mussels into the 90s and 2000s, pollution and habitat loss are big game changers for some populations of coregonines as well. So just so I mean, what I was going to say actually is that we don't have a lot of records into the 80s and 90s in the Great Lakes for many of the lakes. But so now I'd like to just summarize how we're doing this, how we're finding these sources, and some of the research we're doing into these sources. There's some difficulties and there's some assumptions with historical data, of course. One is defining what is spawning. This can get really, really complicated. And so we essentially, we designed a database to have a lot of different options, because for a historical database, we really want to capture the information as exactly as possible. You don't want to try to make assumptions and just call something spawning. You want to provide the user with as much evidence for spawning as possible. And then they can do their queries and actually decide what they want to include. So spawning, there's a lot of different evidence for this. It comes from firsthand knowledge. It comes from surveys where they examine the physiology of the fish. And so I'll talk a little bit about how we deal with that. Species names for coregonines, that's another big, it's very crazy. There's a lot of vernacular for coregonines in the Great Lakes, a lot of nicknames. They've been called a lot of different things. So we have a way to deal with names. Georeferencing, locations there's a lot of slang for different points and reefs. There's a lot of historical research that goes into making sure we know what region we're talking about, what features, what area, what embayment, what point, that kind of thing. Our goal for this database is to eventually get to XY coordinates, make it really nice and mappable. But in many cases, we have to indicate that it's a large area. And so we just tag a centroid of, let's say, a reef shape, and then we indicate with points around the edge of that reef how extensive it actually is. So you'll get a point, but it's in the center of the reef, that kind of thing. Yeah, so yeah, this is just, landmarks are very tricky sometimes. They have multiple regional names, local names. We realized right away we need a database to organize everything. We began building that database and refining it, and that was a very iterative process. And so I'll walk through a little bit of a simplified map of how this database looks. This is where we store this historical information. It all starts with the source level, so like the bibliographic information, the details about the paper, the authors, the number of pages. Is it digital? Is it a physical copy? Where is it from? That kind of information. Then we go to the record level, which is still kind of bibliographic, archivable in a sense. Where physically did we see the record? Is it what page number? Is it in text? Is it in a table? How did we physically decide something was a record? So we're still at that archivable level. Then we get into the event or the operation, which is basically the where or the when of the event. So the date, time, and month, all of our lat long and land feature, location. If we were given dead reckonings, for example, from old compass bearings, that would be entered in here. We tagged a habitat main table off of that so that we can capture any additional information about substrate or temperature or ice. So we want to make sure we capture any of that. Then we move into gears. Gear isn't the main focus of our database, but we don't want to let it go if we have good information about the gear. So especially if it could lead to answering questions about effort historically. So we really have a table for each gear. So pound nets, spearing, hook and line, gill nets, you name it. We don't typically get a lot of detail, I will say, about effort for these gears, but we kept the tables either way. And then we get into the biological side of the database. This deals more with the species, the individual species, the physiology of the fish, the evidence behind why they were called spawning or nursery areas, basically any biological information we can capture about the fish. And we broke it into a couple different groups. Sometimes it's just because records in history are very diverse. Sometimes there's an individual specimen that's described in great detail. And so that often comes from museums. Sometimes there's a big group of species that were caught and they'll say that they were gravid or something like that. So we'll actually enter that data here. Sometimes there were subsamples and more information was collected on the subsamples. So we've broken it down a little bit, but mainly this is just biological. side of the database. This is what the database actually looks like. This is absolutely not for detailed reading, but I like to show this. It's kind of exciting. My point here is that the yellow tables are those main tables I just showed, but all these green ones are reference tables where we basically wrote up a drop-down menu with a numeric code for different options. And that kind of reduces our data entry error. There's plenty of different things with historical document that you can have a drop-down option for, like describing maturity of fish or spawning status of fish. We have species drop-down tables. We have a drop-down table for the method for measuring temperature. I mean, you name it. And so it's quite exciting to build these and maintain them and use them. There's so many because historical documents are so diverse in their information. So here's an example of one of them. Again, this is really small, but it's just to show that there's a lot of evidence that goes into whether something, whether it could have been spawning or not. There's physiological evidence. And so we have a reference table called spawning condition, and it's based on literature and also on things, on descriptions that we find in our sources. And a lot of fish are described like this, especially in like fisheries surveys. They'll say that they were ripe or grab it. They'll use, words like nearly ripe or green is a common one in historical documents, which is immature typically. There's a lot of different descriptions. So having a drop down to find that has really been useful. And then we have other reference tables that relate more to like how you receive the information that the fish were spawning. Was it an interview? Was it a survey where they looked at physiology? How were they observed? How was it reported? So this has been kind of important for us to try to maintain what is a spawning record and what is the evidence behind it. So all this is metadata with a data point that you'll find in our database. Here's all the species that we look for that are in CORHIST. So these, we're missing some. There's all kinds of different debate and literature on whether there are subspecies, what different forms, but these are the standard species we look for in historical literature. And what I've indicated here are how many scientific names and how many common names we've found for this one species and have been able to verify that they're talking about this one species. So see right away, lake whitefish and Cisco especially, 28 scientific names and 20 common names. Again, that's a reference table you can drop down. If you're able to confirm that it's Coregonines artidae, you can, and they also give another name like bluebacks or something, or mud herring. You can go in and find that alternate name and tag it with your data point as metadata so that we never lose the alternate name that they gave to this. Someday, somebody might find that mud herring were a really important population in Lake Superior, and they're going to want to be able to query records related to mud herring and artidae. So we never lose the additional names given to these fish. Our approach is each record is found and researched and entered by an individual, always reviewed by another. We're always assessing for primary sources versus secondary sources and information. And sometimes we use secondary sources because that research group did more research on that primary record and found additional things. So both are important, but we don't want to have a lot of duplication. That's what we're trying to minimize. Georeferencing, we use a lot of metadata related to depth and landmarks and bathymetry maps that are available. We use historical maps and records. Names of towns have changed, names of tributaries and lakes and points. So we use a lot of different sources. And of course, ArcMap a bunch. And then we have weekly meetings to hash these out. If we don't agree on something, we get together and we go through the record and we try to figure it out. If we just can't figure out solid information on location, for example, or species, it might get scrapped. So we have kind of a strict QA/QC there. So what we found so far, we have 204 sources that we've looked at and found records in. That's over 50,000 pages. And we've looked at additional 87 sources that we've queued up as they were useful, but we didn't find any direct records, primary records in them. That led to over 2,300 occurrence records for coregonines. And we call these novel records because we also always look at the Goodyear Spawning Atlas, a very important publication in the 80s, which also has a lot of spawning information and locations for coregonines. So we're always comparing against duplication to Goodyear. So these are novel from Goodyear, over 1,000 of which are spawning and 44 are nursery. We also processed Goodyear to do those comparisons, fixed a lot of locations, and made sure to use our techniques to get to the right reef or shoal or point. And we found over 1,000 records there. So any type of material is can be entered into CORHIST, whether it's a photograph, specimen, scale envelopes. If it's enough information to fit the bill, we can enter it. What our records that we found look like over the years, this is just a graph of number of records we found across years. You'll see right away there's this huge pulse in the just after World War I and into the 20s and 30s. And that's that pulse in fishery science on the Great Lakes that I mentioned. There's a lot of authors behind these big surveys. I put a few up here: the Hubbs, Diamonds, Pritchard, Kelts, Van Oosten. And so we just tend to find a lot of records in that time frame. Our spread is about 200 years long, but we also get a little pulse into the 70s and 80s. There were a lot of spawning atlases being created at this time. And there are a lot of interviews that happened at this time. So there's an increase in records. To compare that with Goodyear, the records, the scale is a little off here. So everything got smashed down because of the 1920s for us. But across time, it's about the same. It does tend to really flare up though towards the 70s and 80s. And that's because Goodyear used a lot of personal communication around that time and interviews. And so you tend to get the year stamped on those records up towards the 70s and 80s. You get that increase. That's kind of exciting. If I look at the species, the number of records for each species in each lake, this is going to be kind of a lot of information, but this is just one of the things we do regularly to monitor how many records we're getting for each species. For Lake Superior, you'll see that Artidae and Clupeiformis, the Cisco and whitefish, are both we always find more records for those two. Lake Huron, it's a similar story. And Lake Michigan, we find quite a few records for Cisco and whitefish. Lake Erie, I've kept the scales the same on these axes. So Lake Erie is actually quite low. We haven't found a lot of records for Lake Erie, or at least we'd like to find more. So you can see right away, Lake Erie is quite low. Lake Ontario, a little pulse with Cisco and whitefish, but also quite low. And then tributaries and connecting channels. Again, just most popular with Cisco and whitefish. So this is a good way for us to monitor what we want to try to find and focus our efforts in the archives. This is a graph, sort of a general scheme that I put together. I thought was kind of fun. It's some summaries from the database so far. And what it'll show is just the general depth of spawning in our records for each species, and also the time frame by month. And so in our records, Yohani, the chub from back in the day, which is considered extinct today, was one of the earliest fall spawners. In our records, it's about August to September. And it was one of the deeper ones that spawned deep. Kaiai and Xenithicus, also pretty deep spawners. And the next on the list, these in our records are about October to December in some cases, but Alpine also, I know it was considered synonymous with Xenithicus, but also valid and considered extinct. It was a larger bodied deep water coregonine. These were sort of a mid-depth range spawner. And generally our records show that they were spawning in November or October through December, really. But yeah, no, it was mostly November. Then we have Ardidai, whitefish, and round whitefish. So lake whitefish and round whitefish. November and December, pretty standard. Lake whitefish tend to be a little earlier in our records than Cisco. Negripinus, the blackfin, that's the next one. That was about December to January in our records. And then bloater, late February to March, we have a lot of records for spawning. And last, but definitely not least, the short nose Rigardi, once considered extinct and now considered to be around, is a really mysterious and cool deeper water coregonine. They were mid-range spawners according to our records, and most of them are in May, so which is really interesting, a spring spawner. So this is sort of a general scheme of that. It tends to match pretty well with the literature, and both with fisheries independent data that was done, studies related to that, and in reviews, it tends to match up fairly well. Looking just at Cisco in our records, I just wanted to look at the depth across all the lakes that we have spawning records for. And you'll see that Lake Superior kind of smashes everything else. Lake Superior, it's kind of amazing. We have records of spawning. We have a few outliers at 600 feet deep, one at over 900 that it was said that they were broadcast spawning. But the majority of spawning records are much deeper than the rest of the lakes. The rest of them tend to be in this range of depth and pretty standard, are pretty close to each other. And then just for an excuse to make a word cloud, because I'll take any excuse for that, I wanted to look at the most trending substrate designation in our records. And you'll see right away for Ardidai that rock is very popular. Mud occasionally in Lake Superior tended to trend a lot as a designation, but you tend to see rock quite a bit, rocks and sand. And interesting, in Lake Ontario, you get the honeycomb rock designation, which is basically bedrock with cracks in it. So that's kind of an exciting thing to look at in our records. So we like to look at those trends and keep tabs on what we're finding. Now I just want to talk briefly about how we begin to use these data. So the primary focus of our database is to make maps. And so here is, I'll just use Ardidai as an example. The stars are spawning locations in our records. The green circles are nursery, and then the hollow circles are unknown. So they're an occurrence record where we didn't have enough evidence at this point to coin it as a nursery or spawning. And we make these maps quite a bit as part of QA/QC, again, to see where we're skimpy on data points and what's happening, examine for different trends. This is all CORHIST data without Goodyear. If I turn on Goodyear data, you can see, Lake Erie fills in a little bit more, which is really nice. I'll just blink this on and off. There's not a lot of duplication, which is really great. This is part of our QA/QC, is to recognize that and fix it, remove it. Lake Ontario fills in more. We're still short in Georgian Bay for records, and Southern Lake Huron, really. Northern Lake Superior to an extent as well. So we do this quite a bit to again, focus in on the archives. If I push in on Lake Huron for Cisco, with all of our records, you can see that there are certain embayments. There were also they're near popular fishing areas, of course. A lot of our records can be tied back to fishing activity, certainly. But if I zoom in even further, what I want to show the group is, let's go up to this spot near the Elatiano Islands, west of Detour, and push in on that. In our database, we want as much metadata tied to these records as possible. So if you were to click the information for that point there, what you would see is all the associated metadata, including the source that came from. This is Oregon et al. Spawning Atlas record from the late 70s. We want to make sure that the point corresponds to the correct reef as we overlay it on bathymetry. You'll get information like the page numbers, the names that were used for the fish, the year range, reef names, things like that. Substrate. There's a lot of metadata that's missing, as is typical with historic stuff, but we want to try to include as much as possible to these records. We also want to look, recently we've been looking for areas where spawning and nursery for Artidae at this point are within proximity. So here's an example. It's 3 different sources: South Baymouth, Fitzwilliam Island area, Lake Huron, where you can see that there's some corresponding points with nursery and spawning. Up in the Apostle Island area of Lake Superior, this also is pretty commonly seen in our records, which is kind of exciting. So it's an interesting query that we've been doing to try to look for that association. And then just to show this, here are all the tributary and connecting channel data points for Coregonines artidae for the Cisco that we have in our database. And so this is kind of exciting. We've had a lot of conversations with other research groups about, the importance of these areas, and I think it's quite exciting. This is without Goodyear, and then blinking on Goodyear records as well. You can see that not a lot of duplication. There certainly are a few tributaries that light up that we have pretty solid records for coregonines entering and spawning. And then just quick contrast, I'm not going to go through all the species, but a data poor species like Regardi, you'll see a vastly different map than Artidae. We don't have any nursery records for this species that we found. And it's very sparse here and there related to spawning records. Like Michigan is pretty filled in due to some targeted surveys in the 30s for specifically coregonines and deep water species. So yeah, I also did a word cloud for this. So a little bit of a different designation becomes popular for Regardi, clay and mud. But that's a data poor example. There's just not a lot of records. So our next steps is we have more QA/QC to do and plenty more work there. It's getting there. Publish data. We want to publish these maps, make them available and public to inform, any project really. Could be human dimensions, could be fish restoration. We want to digitize some larger collections. There's the commercial catch records that we can talk about if there's time. I saved it until the end in case there wasn't time, but that's a whole nother story. Commercial catch reports is quite a big project that's related to CORHIST. And then we want to use CORHIST primarily to inform that gap analysis of the restoration framework and hopefully the other planning phases as well, and be able to build species distribution models and compare maps from these data. So I'll start winding down there, I think, and I'd be happy to answer any questions or get into any discussion if there is any.
Wow. Cory, that's really impressive. When you blink,
May I have your attention,
Oops,
please?
announcement.
It's the owner of the red Mazda in the parking lot. We do need you to move it. If you are the owner of the red Mazda in the back parking lot, please move your car.
It's not my Mazda, I don't think.
goodness. Construction out our window. Okay, so when you were blinking on and off Goodyear, it's remarkable how much new information you uncovered. That's sort of my first impression. Just pat on the back. That's really cool. I've seen parts of this before, but I don't think I'd seen it presented that way. And then secondly, just another comment. When you were, I love the way that I think it was slide 33, when you put sort of depth on the x-axis and time of spawning on the,
Yeah, 33. Yeah.
So when you did that, I thought, oh, those aren't feet, those are meters, because that is still really shallow for a lot of the deep water species. But
yeah,
feet. It probably really is feet because it's limited by sort of where most of these data come from, sort of commercial records and the inability or the difficulty in sort of getting off into the deeper waters. So I guess that'll just have to be something that we think about in terms of the bias potentially associated with some of these spawning data. And you talked about that, but
yeah, it's a big part of it, and it needs to be considered every step of the way, including when you do summaries like this. This is very general, and there are probably deep dives we could take into this to get like reasonable numerical like averages and look at what we're looking at. But yeah, this is, the extent to which many of these surveys could sample and survey and understand things, or fish for that matter. So yeah, that's a good point.
All right. I see Taylor has a question.
All right. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah. Perfect.
Yeah, this is super cool, Cory. I'm really glad to see this all coming together and all sorts of super cool information. I could not help but notice when you were showing the tributary map, all going on in the St. Lawrence River, which I had previously seen some historical observations of fish running up the St. Lawrence, but I saw like even up to Quebec City, you have an observation. So I was really interested in hearing if you had any insight into those observations or what you remember about them.
Yeah, this is kind of cool. Yeah, way up the St. Lawrence. Many of these, I just put occurrence in here as these little pink diamonds. But what we can do, let me know if you can see this. I'll pull up the actual, I'll do the most dangerous thing and pull up ArcMap in a live call. And we can actually look. So a lot of these are nursery records. So nursery, there's a lot of ways to designate that. And I kind of chose what is a nursery for this talk, but a user of the database would be able to turn on and off things that they didn't want. But basically my rules were anything young of the year. If it were ag observations or anything like that, it would go more towards spawning location designation. And even like larvae recently hatched don't quite usually make the cut. So it has to be like young of the year. The habitat came into play a little bit. So these were young of the year fish that were sampled right on shore up here. And then if I just click the information for this, I don't actually remember what this one is. It does work. It works. Oh, it pulled up in a different screen, of course. Yeah, so that is an outlet of Lake St. Charles, it says, which connects to the St. Lawrence, I believe. Lake St. Charles near Quebec. And that was an adult occurring there. So we didn't, the evidence that we had is that they had spawning tubercles. So they had sometimes called pearl organs, but they were looking a little spawny. So it's not a spawning designation. It wasn't enough evidence, but it certainly there's some evidence for what those fish were doing up there. And then these young fish, the theory in the original report, which I think was from the 1930s, was that they had moved down river this far, but there was some debate on that. They're pretty small fish. I think we probably, if I pull up the info on one of these, let's see, so that was 1931, it was late June, and they were called young fish. So it's a little bit vague, but from the record, it looked like they were very young, very small. So yeah, I mean, that's a good, it was 3 feet of water as well. It was really exciting. You know, we certainly included stuff like that when we found it. We stayed away from inland lake populations. I think that could be a whole nother can of worms for someone, or maybe it perhaps already is. But any kind of connection that we could find, the connecting channels like St. Mary's River, that's fairly common data to find. But yeah, that was a surprising one.
Yeah, thanks for indulging me. It's always interesting to sort of see what types of information we have, and maybe we don't have a lot of information about that because it was one of the earliest to be fished out, perhaps. And sort of looping that into the Ontario Erie sort of lack of information. So yeah, I appreciate it. And I could spend a lot of time just poking around at these points.
Yeah, great. That's what I want to hear.
While we wait for others, Cory, I'm really struck by Georgian Bay, the lack of information. You noted that in your talk. Could there be information out there in Ontario that you just haven't been able to get to because of, now obviously last year you've been able to travel more, but are there more sources out there? I guess a more general question, and would Ontario be a place to sort of concentrate efforts or sort of use venues like this to sort of increase awareness of other sources that you might not yet have uncovered? Or
Yeah, so I'll say yes right out of the gate to that, because the reason why we're making these maps fairly regularly is to set our sights on areas like that. And one of the sort of catches is that we never really were able to travel to a lot of archives physically. A lot of the data collection and finding sources happened when no one was traveling, and we're all able to connect really well via Teams. But and so we stayed in tune with each other, but we weren't able to physically go to locations. So like Archives of Ontario, Canada's National Archives, I imagine they're loaded with stuff. And so we still need to spend some time. We certainly hope to spend some time searching those catalogs. At the end of any talk like this, I also like to ask anyone in the audience, if they're thinking of an old report or a record. Much of this hasn't been scanned. It's a one of a kinder. And I've seen so many documents that I know it was the only copy and it was all water stained, and I pulled it out of a rusty file cabinet. If you're thinking of your bio station and you're thinking of a stash like that, please reach out and we can certainly look at trying to get stuff scanned and looked at, saved. So yeah, we have our sights set on that. Yeah.
Wendy just dropped a suggestion in the chat. Let's see. So Old South Bay Research Station.
South Bay Research Station. Oh man, I would love to get there.
Your next door neighbor has her hand up. Hopefully this audio will work okay.
Yeah.
I can put it in the chat if we, oh.
If I can, I'll mute myself and it might help you, Amanda.
Thanks, Cory. I was just curious because I saw you had historical records of round whitefish in Lake Superior, but I didn't see any records you found for pygmy whitefish. Is there a question of whether round whitefish actually might be pygmy, or there just aren't any pygmy records because they were such a, not a target species? Just curious.
Yeah, that's a tough one. We found occurrence records for pygmies, of course, but we haven't found anything solid on, we haven't found enough evidence for those points that they were spawning, unfortunately. And so that's something I originally didn't have pygmies on that graph I showed. It was sort of just a general graph of spawning times and spawning depths. Because we don't have anything. And so I know there's some publications out there that suggest some stuff, but I think it's folks on the call, please correct me if I'm wrong, but according to our research, we can't really find details on them spawning in the Great Lakes. In other populations, they've been found in rivers spawning in different lakes, but in the Great Lakes proper, we can't find much. We certainly, it's just an interesting thing. I don't think they weren't a target of a lot of research or fisheries, so they're just a little bit underlooked, unfortunately, in the archives.
How about anybody, like I saw we had Mark Vincent on earlier. I don't know if he's still on. Contemporary sampling and handling of pygmy whitefishes. Has anybody looked to see sort of time of the year based on gonatosomatic indexes, or they're not even that frequently encountered in the trawl surveys? I don't know if we still have that.
That's a good question. Be worth querying our VCAT and doing some more contemporary queries. We haven't dove into contemporary stuff too much. That's sort of the next. We kind of went chronologically as early as we can get, and now we're fading towards this late. We're about up to like the 2000s with our records, but there certainly could be stuff out there. Our VCAT, our database at USGS, does have a lot of good information on like maturation and even spawning status in some cases. That would be great evidence and worth a search for sure.
Thanks, Amanda. Cory, you might just briefly talk about the next step in terms of using these data for that mapping to inform the framework, now that your method has been approved by the fishery managers, and how you and Karen are going to be, you have a scientist that's going to be starting soon to help do
Yeah,
that modeling.
yeah, happy to. So yeah, more details about that next step. We started this Spawning Atlas 2.0 project, this CORHIST project, with our sights set on that coregonine restoration framework. It's very clear that the framework is going to need to be informed by history, and history will come into play with a lot of different planning phases of that framework. And so in another project, we got together another really great multidisciplinary team of scientists and developed this methodology for that gap analysis. And Dr. Karen Alofs was a co-lead on that, and I was a co-lead on that team. And we recently got that methodology approved by the Joint Strategic Plan Committees, each lake, and then the Council of Lake Committees ultimately in the fall in, was that 2022, Bo? Yeah, the years are blurring even, but and so that's really exciting. So all those committees got to review this methodology and all collectively agree that this is the way to go. So our next step is to use this historical data to merge these projects, essentially, to use CORHIST to inform those species distribution models. And we want to do this by hiring, we have plans to hire a new postdoctoral researcher at University of Michigan who will take the lead on developing these models and using these foundational data to do so. And so, yeah, it's really an exciting, so we just got that cooperative agreement approved actually. So things are really happening, and we're super excited to start this next phase of, I guess, implementation of the gap analysis starting this spring and summer.
Okay, great. Got a few questions in the chat. I don't see any in person. The first, well, just, are you able to follow the chats and see Wendy's suggestion?
Oh, yeah, let me see.
So talking about the OMNRF library in Peterborough would be a good place. And then Glenora there on the Bay of Quincy would be another. I think that's been there since 1880 or so.
Oh yeah.
Longest. You've probably been there before for your sea lamprey work. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I got excited. Yeah, Glenora was very cool to visit, and I know they have amazing records. Same with Cape Vincent across the islands there. If you can get to both of those biostations, they're packed with history.
Yes.
Yep.
There's Ellery Morano has a question in the chat. I imagine that a lot of the historical records are not standardized. How did you handle interpreting those data?
Yeah, yep, they're definitely not standardized. They come in all different forms. It's with historical information, with a typical historical database, not related to spawning grounds or biology at all. You essentially translate almost the entire artifact into data fields word for word. And so historical databases try to capture everything. We kept a little bit of that spirit. We're more in the business of conveying all the evidence that was there and making it really nicely queryable so that a user might look at it and say, okay, I'm only interested in interviews where multi-generational commercial fishers said that these areas were spawning grounds. So you could turn that on and off. Or another researcher may say, I'm only interested in fisheries independent data, where there was a research group out, they standardized their methods, and they looked at maturation to say whether something was spawning or not. So you can turn those on and off. So all the evidence, it essentially, the way we deal with it is just add everything, every bit of evidence we can have, and make it really nicely queryable. Because we don't want to make assumptions about what kind of knowledge might inform some environmental problem in the future. It's hard to know. Everything has a really important application down the line, and it just always comes back around as being important when it's a historical archive.
Okay. Let's do one more from the chat, and then I see Zach's hand is up. Wendy asked, what are the plans for longer term maintenance of the database?
Yeah, excellent question, Wendy. I hope to keep this database going. It's something that I have no problem keeping up with. For all of, honestly, anyone on this call that studies or writes is kind of a historian as well. You're finding new articles and things. As new things are discovered, it's fairly straightforward to enter it. So it'll be maintained with me as long as I'm around. And hopefully its legacy lives on and grows. But yeah, it's honestly hard for me to stop wanting to try to find things. So it'll certainly slow down unless we find a bigger collection and can get additional funding and support to tackle that. But maintenance, yeah, here at the Science Center. And we also have a really great process for data releases and updates as well, which I'll be sure everyone knows about.
Okay, good question. Zach has been studying coregonine spawning habitat, I know, in Lake Erie a lot.
Yeah, very interested in the early life stuff. Really cool. We've collected eggs in Lake Erie, eggs and larvae. But I was curious about sort of thinking about reintroductions of various populations. In all of your readings, did you come across where humans moved fish maybe from Lake Erie to inland populations so that we can go back and kind of grab those fish for reintroducing into lakes, find those genetics?
Yeah, so in the spirit of this database, we fired up another study, actually inherited from Wendy. So Wendy will know a lot about this. Wendy historically collected a lot of fish stocking data and began to make connections using maps and put together a database. And we took that and ran with it and have been working on a database inspired by this one with as much metadata as we can add, all that good stuff, to look at where coregonines specifically were raised, where they were sourced from, and where they were moved. And Jim McKenna is a lead on that project as well. And there's a big team there. Again, we dove into the archives. And so we're now starting to put together maps with arrows that show where these fish were moved. Tremendous amounts moved out of Lake Erie, from the Erie hatchery all across, bordering states and even beyond. I think there's a few records where they were shipped to New Zealand. They were shipped out west. And you imagine, this is like 1890. This is probably sailing ship stuff. I mean, or maybe steamer, but it's just amazing. And so, there's something underway to be able to track this. And I know that they recently gave a progress report. So it's coming up to being pretty close to releasing that data, I'm sure.
Very cool. Thanks.
Yeah. I'll keep you in the loop on it for sure.
Okay. Chris Dye had a question asking about, are you adding contemporary information? And so if not, sort of what makes something historical? Do you have a cutoff date or? Yeah,
such a good question. That's years of debate with that exact question that we've had. And we've settled in the gap analysis methodology. We went back to the literature and looked at the history of the Great Lakes and environmental disturbances and species collapses. We used a lot of data on production for coregonines to look at when production slowed down or tanked even, to try to set these dates to decide what was historical and what was contemporary. And what was most agreed upon and what was approved by the lake committees was that basically post 2000 for our purposes can be considered more contemporary. It's post ecosystem regime shift, post dry synod impacts. And then for historical, it'd be before that, but really before 1960 was pre in many cases. Not for all the lakes though. It's a pretty general rule, and we have all kinds of sidebars to that. One is Lake Superior. Really, there's a lot of things that are still natural in Lake Superior, as we all know. There are populations that still persist. There are things that were reduced, but still exist. Lake Superior is a little bit different. In fact, as you look at every Great Lake, Lake Erie, for example, Cisco has crashed very severely in 1925. So, way earlier than 1960. So in general, it's a 2000, 1960 rule, but we certainly always have exemptions to that.
Cory, I had a question kind of having to do with lake trout. We had Randy, he may have just stepped off. We have Ellen, I don't know if she's listening, but sort of the lake trout restoration that's well ahead, of course, of the coregonines. There were questions about where to stock lake trout, for example. And I know there must have been some investigations into the historical literature. And I also get the sense that in some places, lake trout and whitefish and Cisco may be using similar, roughly similar habitat, but maybe different sort of microhabitats. Did you, when you tended to find sort of coregonine records, did you also sort of see any association with lake trout records? And I don't know if you could comment on that, or if Ellen has a thought, if she's still there, or Randy's still there, or anybody else sort of making the connection to lake trout.
Yeah, I'll comment, but I'm excited to hear from Ellen, and also hello, Ellen, and Randy as well. In our searches, lake trout is the one exemption for the CORHIST database. The lake trout made it in. So we have a species code, a numeric code for lake trout, because we tend to find that spawning areas overlapped, especially with lake whitefish. And so we don't want to let go of lake trout. It's in, so that kind of answers your question. I don't, and then once we added it, I didn't find as many as I thought I would, but we certainly do. We also find river spawning population evidence for lake trout as well, just like we do for whitefish and Cisco. Very historical, 1890s, they tend to fade off from the records. But so we have lake trout in the database for that exact reason. Yep.
Yeah.
Ellen, I think
you're on mute if you can. Yeah.
We tinkered a little bit with history in Lake Michigan. The Cobley and Horrell documents were beautiful. Basically, interviewing the old time gill netters before they died out, quite literally. So there's some great information there. Of course, the Goodyear document. We've done a little bit of the same thing for Lake Champlain, and it's really engrossing to hear what you're doing, because I'd love somebody to do that for Champlain, where there was, the same pictures of, 12 strong young men pulling seines in along the shoreline sort of thing. We still don't know why our lake trout went extinct in 1900. Looking at your images of the trap nets and the pound nets, that's amazing. Could we have wiped them out by shoreline, seine, and trap net? That's a really interesting question. So we're going into a lot of the commercial fish statistics and the old Fish Commission documents, the annual reports of the Vermont Fish Commission, and town halls are a great place for those kinds of old documents, and the Capitol Library in Montpelier. So I understand that hunt. It's fascinating. Yeah.
Yes, indeed.
Beautiful job putting it together.
Thank you.
Chris Wilson sort of picked up on that thread in the chat. Cory, including lake trout records would be very interesting for river spawning populations. You wondered if you recall their distributions where you did see the lake trout river spawners.
Yeah, I remember these were some tributaries along the North Shore, I believe, Ontario waters of Lake Superior, I think. I'd have to go back to the records and really look for this to make sure I answer your question good, but I certainly could follow up. But I remember it being very patchy in the historical records and kind of mysterious. There certainly were runs that were caught, and back in the day they would seine a lot, but they would also build these little weirs, very traditional way to fish, river migrating fish. And a lot of these were like trading post lookouts in the 1840s and 50s where they were doing this kind of stuff. And so the records are based on journal entries for daily logs and things and handwritten documents. So I know it's a little patchy, but that's one place that I remember that coming up.
The reason I was asking is the only ones that I'm aware of were northeastern Lake Superior.
Oh.
So essentially north of Sault Ste. Marie was the Montreal and the Dog Rivers, up to Pakasaw, and then along the north shore of Lake Superior. But essentially there's two publications that did exactly what you described, that mined old records from trading posts. But I'm just curious for the other Great Lakes, did any other records show up? We have anecdotal evidence it may actually be a heritable behavior, so it is very interesting.
Yeah, I would love to know, and nothing comes to mind. So it's an excellent question. Yeah.
Oh, it was worth asking.
Yeah, very much. Yeah.
Great. Oh, thanks.
So it looks like we're winding down. Just a few more things from the chat. Kevin Keeler's asking when your coregonine history book will be out.
It might be a digital version of a book in the form of a database that you can sit and query maybe. But yeah, you never know. That would be
Okay.
very cool. And I love that suggestion, Kevin.
And Wendy asked, Wendy has a database background and she's familiar with all of our databases at the Great Lakes Science Center. Any plans to link the various databases, CORHIST, the stocking database, the scale archive, the genetics database,
Ugh. Yeah,
RVCat?
there's been a lot of discussion. One of the problems with our database, the CORHIST database, is it has so many fields and so many main tables that it doesn't merge well. It doesn't play nice with other databases we've found. And then other ones, they have a nice structure because it's always been the same format for the data coming in for years, like the commercial catch database, the Comcat database. That's a good example where we thought, let's just try to merge it with this CORHIST database. But ultimately, the data scientists on the call and folks that know, I don't know, I'm not a database expert. And they were like, you know what, this thing does not fit. And it's best left by itself. So in certain cases, we're leaving them by themselves, but that conversation comes up regularly. It'd be interesting to see what could merge over, become combined.
Okay, so unless there's any final questions, somebody wants to pop their camera on. I think that's it. So if you're able in this virtual environment to give I don't know, it's the hand clap, I guess, and some of the reactions, depending on what version. Thanks so much for so many of you for staying on throughout this discussion. We still have still almost 50 people online, Cory. So, and I know this was something, a different kind of talk in terms of some of the history and beautiful images you pulled up, and and I think all of us can see the power in the data that you're collecting and will be useful not only for us in the short term, but probably for generations to come. So great job, and thanks for doing this for us.
Yeah, thanks everybody for tuning in. It was really a pleasure.
All right, we'll see you all hopefully next month for Alex Duncan's talk on Indigenous knowledge.